Good afternoon. If you all take your seats, we'll start in about 1 minute. Louder? Can you hear me in the back? I'm okay? Okay, if you'd make sure your cell phones are on quiet, please. My name is Martin Eskejian. I'm the chairman of the Ararat Eskejian Museum, and this was my dad's vision to build the church here, the chapel, and the downstairs in the museum. And we're glad you're all here today. It's another event. We have another event coming next week, and Maggie has things continuing. So stay tuned, and if it's your first time, we welcome you. If it's your 10th or 100th time, we're glad you're here too. So at this time, I'm going to introduce Rupen Berberian from Nasser to introduce the speaker, and I will step down. Rupen.
Well, first of all, welcome, and thank you for not being tempted to go to the Academy Awards and come here instead. I know there was a lot of competing parties and stuff like that, so we really appreciate you being here. Today's event is sponsored by the Ararat Eskejian Museum, the National Association for Armenian Studies, and also the UCLA Graduate Colloquium. Asya spoke on Friday at UCLA. And there was 9 speakers. It was a very successful event. It was a packed house. And 3 of the speakers from the colloquium also spoke at the ARPA Institute yesterday on Saturday. So this is the 3rd event. Asya Darbinian is a PhD candidate at Clark University. And her thesis is Russian Empire's response to the Armenian genocide and assistance to Armenian refugees at the Caucasus battlefront of World War I. So today's topic is very much related to her thesis. She received a Kalush Gulbenkian Foundation grant in the spring of 2016, a Thomas McBain Fellow from 2013 to 2016, and she's received NASA research grants in 2011, along with the Knights of Vartan Fund, and in 2014 and 2015. Before that, she received her master's degree at Yerevan State University, and there her thesis was Near East Relief Humanitarian Assistance to Armenians in the Middle East. And before that, she received a bachelor's degree in international relations, also from Yerevan State University. She has several memberships, including the American Historical Association, Society of Armenian Studies, the National Association of Armenian Studies and Research, the International Association of Genocide Scholars, the International Network of Genocide Scholars at Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, the Middle Eastern Studies Association, and the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. And she mentioned that she's particularly fond of that one, and it's really very much related to her thesis topic. Before that, she had the opportunity to work at the Armenian Genocide Museum Institute in Yerevan from October 12th to August 13th. She was the deputy director, and before that, she was a senior researcher. Before that, she was a visiting scholar, a Carnegie Research Fellow at UCLA under the supervision of Richard Hovhanessian. She speaks several languages, some full proficiency and a little bit less on some of the other ones, English, Russian, Armenian, and Turkish. And she has 1 credit in the English language, at least, in a book that came out, The Plight and Fate of Children During and Following the Genocide, edited by Samuel Toden, and here she has a joint article with Rubina Perumian, and that book came out in 2014. Asya Darbinian is part of the new crop of scholars coming out of Clark University, and Taner Akçam is heading that effort, and all the names that you're familiar with, like Khachik Muradyan, Asya Darbinian, Anna Alaksanyan, and Emre Daglioglu, and Ümit Kurt on the top. He wasn't there that day, but I put a picture of him on top. So we're pretty excited with what's happening at Clark University. And here, there's a couple more pictures of her with Ronald Suni, with Garo Pailan, Professor Dvorak, who's at Clark University, Richard Hovanesian, Haik Demoyan, Rubinia Purumian. So now, without any further delay, I'd like to have Asya Darbinian come to the podium to give her talk.
Thank you very much for this honor. It is really an honor for me to be here. Thank you for your kind introduction and for organizing this event on this Sunday afternoon, the Oscar day. I appreciate that our guests could spare time and join us for this lecture. Let me just open the presentation. So today I will present my work in progress, the initial results and thoughts on my dissertation research, which aims to understand Russian Empire's response to the Armenian Genocide and to the refugee crisis on the Caucasus battlefront of World War I. The picture that you see on this very first slide, it represents actually a postcard that was made for the fundraising campaign for the refugees in Russian Empire. It says, "Помогите беженцам," help the refugees. And this is one among the many postcards that they produced for this specific purpose, to collect money and to provide help to the refugees in need. Recent developments in the Middle East and the legitimate concerns about the fate of thousands of refugees from Syria have drawn attention of major powers, governments, agencies, and finally scholars, particularly the ones working in fields related to genocide and refugee studies and history of humanitarianism. The disappointing yet apparent inability and sometimes even lack of willingness to confront the current emergency by certain governments or agencies demonstrate that we still have a lot to learn and understand from our past experiences about dealing with the refugee crisis. As you see in these two photos, they are not very different, although they were taken a century apart. The first photo is Armenian and Greek refugees, orphans. We know about them also as Near East relief orphans, and they are coming to Greece to survive. And then Syrian refugee children that are also trying to survive, escaping to Greece. Pursuing my research in Armenian genocide studies through this lens of exploring the fate of the refugees and the complexity of humanitarianism at the beginning of the 20th century, I aim at contributing to this crucial yet understudied field of history of humanitarianism, and of course, of history of Armenian people. My research will offer new understanding of such theoretical terms and concepts as humanitarianism and altruism versus imperial policy and colonization, refugee flow and relief work versus population migration and displacement by military necessity, refugee status and refugee rights during the Great War period versus refugees, asylum seekers, and IDPs nowadays after the 1951 Convention on Refugees. My research will raise also the voices of refugees. I attempt to do that. The receivers of the humanitarian assistance, or as scholars call it, objects of humanitarianism, and will emphasize the importance of self-organization and the role refugees themselves played in the struggle for survival. Well, now why Russian response? I chose Russian response to Armenian genocide as my research topic because this subject remains little known over 100 years after the Armenian genocide. While there is a robust literature on representation, on responses to Armenian genocide by America, British Empire, Scandinavian states, even Germany, as you see some of the books that I'm presenting in my slide, none of them speaks about Russian response to Armenian genocide. Indeed, there is no secondary literature as such to use for my research, so most of my sources are primary sources for which I go to archives in Russia, in St. Petersburg and Moscow, to Georgia in Tbilisi, to Armenian National Archives, of course, and there are a couple of archives based in United States that also serve as sources for my research, such as the archives of Hoover Institution at Stanford University, where I was just last month. The front page of the June 30, 1916 issue of the Parisian newspaper Excelsior carried an illustration of a Russian soldier on horseback with a refugee child in his arms. The picture was captioned "The symbol of protection of the Armenians by Russians." Although the words Russia and humanitarianism are rarely coupled in the historical literature on the 20th century, it is important to explore Imperial Russia's reaction to Armenian genocide and the refugee crisis in Caucasus. The Russian imperial government, as well as a number of non-governmental organizations, or in those days so-called public organizations, established in Russian Empire, provided humanitarian assistance to hundreds of thousands of Armenian refugees in need. The recognition of an emergency situation transformed political and public reaction in Imperial Russia into action, efficiently implemented relief work for Armenian refugees. Proceeding to my work, I came up with a number of important research questions that I address in my dissertation. Among those, what motivated Russian authorities to launch such an intensive humanitarian and relief work for Armenian refugees? What was the Russian imperial government's vision with regards to the future of Ottoman Armenian refugees? Did Russian authorities have a concrete plan for the occupied territories of eastern Turkey? Why were many refugees from those regions prohibited to return home? Was the Russian relief work for Armenian refugees humanitarianism, or was it part of a larger imperial or colonization project, or did these agendas overlap? Besides, to what extent were policies of Russian authorities towards Armenians general rather than specific policies? While Russian and Ottoman troops fought on the Caucasus front of World War I, hundreds of thousands of Ottoman Armenian subjects were targeted by Turkish authorities as a potential strategic threat. Justifying their actions as military necessity, the Ottomans massacred the Armenians or deported them to deserts of Mesopotamia. Those who did not fall victim became refugees on the Russian-Ottoman battlefront and elsewhere. Armenians suffered numerous hardships during the 18th-19th century Russo-Turkish wars, but the one that started in the fall of 1914 had unprecedented consequences for the Armenians, particularly for the Ottoman or Western Armenians. This time, the consequences were catastrophic as the Armenians fell victim to a systematically implemented genocide under the cover of World War I. These two maps show us the situation through two different lenses. One is the well-known map of the Armenian Genocide. It shows the deportation routes, the killing sites, while the other, less known one, represents the Caucasus battlefront of World War I and the constantly changing border from 1914 to 1918. This changing line speaks for itself and demonstrates the tragedy of those people living or temporarily sheltered in those areas during the genocide and the war, and forced to move back and forth those lines with no concrete plans or expectations, just trying to survive. The Great War began in Europe in July 1914. The war over the Straits and on the Caucasus front between the Ottoman and Russian empires unrolled in November 1914. The murder of Armenian peasants and priests and the wiping out of entire villages on the Russian-Ottoman border ensued. German missionary Dr. Johannes Lapsius put the number of Armenian victims in these frontier zones at the beginning, not even the main stage of genocide, already 7,000 in November-December 1914. As Raimon Yevorkian has observed, and I quote, the majority of the massacres took place before Enver launched his offensive on Sarikamish in Kars province, Russian Empire, which was in December 1914. Reports about the Turkish atrocities against the Armenians quickly reached the Russian Empire. Mikhail Babajanov, the Russian State Duma representative of the Baku, Yelisavetpol, and Erivan regions, Erivan was the way it was called in those days, and I'm using the name as it was used in the documents of the time, claimed in his July 1915 speech in the Duma in Russian parliament that the Turks had targeted Armenians in the bordering region of the Caucasus front before Russian troops had even entered, annihilating them as, and I quote, an element having close ties with Russia. Babajanov, like many other statesmen in the Russian Empire, attempted to bring the Turks' violence against the Armenians to wider attention. By spring-summer 1915, the Russian Empire's southwest Transcaucasia was flooded with tens of thousands of Armenian refugees and internally displaced persons who had been forced to abandon their homes in the Russian-Ottoman bordering regions, such as Kars, Ardahan, Olti, Altyn, Alashkert, Basen, and other towns. In addition to the Armenians displaced by pre-war incidents and then warfare between the two empires, new waves of genocide refugees from the Ottoman Empire were expected every day. These were Armenians who had escaped the massacres and deportations organized by the Turkish authorities in various parts of Ottoman Empire. According to Taner Akçam, who happens to be also my advisor, he writes that the first deportation of Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire began in February 1915 and gained momentum in the months that followed. As historian Ron Suni has explained, and I quote, deportations ostensibly taken for military reasons rapidly radicalized monstrously into an opportunity to rid Anatolia once and for all of those peoples perceived to be an imminent existential threat to the future of the empire. End quote. The nationwide deportation and annihilation of Armenians began in April-May 1915 and continued during the entire period of the Great War. The official response of the Russian Empire to horrifying developments, both in Ottoman Empire and on the Caucasus front, was immediate condemnation. Russia's joint declaration with Great Britain and France in May 1915, in which they defined these atrocities against Armenians in Ottoman Empire as crime against humanity, is one of the most known documents of the time. In that document, These powers also promised to hold members of the Ottoman government and those implicated in massacres personally responsible for those crimes. Yet, little is known about the role played by Sergei Sazonov, the foreign minister of Russian Empire, in drafting this declaration. Sazonov proposed public condemnation of the Ottoman government for the slaughter of its own Armenian subjects and engaged later British and French diplomats in the process. As historian Peter Hallquist writes, the dynamic, and I quote, the dynamic of internal reporting on the massacres of Armenians caused the Russian government to initiate the joint Allied note. These pictures I took at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University, and I was working on materials of this fascinating collection. It's called Sazonov Papers. It's comprised of Empire's ministers' memoirs, official and personal correspondence. I can expand more about the archives and work there if you're interested in at the Q&A session, because it may take too long if I start doing it now. A series of undertakings followed the joint declaration that ministers initiated. Sazonov himself reflected on the massacres in his July 1915 speech to the State Duma, to Russian Parliament, and he said, and I quote, "Armenians suffer unprecedented persecution now. The persecutions in the refugee movement that ensued were tragic for the Armenian people and also highly problematic for the Russian civil and military authorities, whose first and foremost goal at that point was to win the war. Russian political and public figures not only protested Ottoman violence, but also pressed for relief work to confront this emergency situation. A number of organizations and committees were engaged in the Armenian refugee relief effort in the Russian Empire. Among them, the Committee of Her Highness Grand Duchess Tatiana Nikolaevna, or the Princess Tatiana, the All-Russian Union of Towns, All-Russian Union of Zemstvos, the Russian Red Cross, the full name of the organization was Russian Society of the Red Cross, national committees such as Armenian benevolent organizations founded in various parts of Russian Empire, as well as located in actual territory of Armenia, participated in this huge effort. Most of the Russian organizations were established as war relief committees to assist the wounded and sick on the front line. With the influx of hundreds of thousands of refugees into the interior of Russian Empire, these institutions developed into refugee and orphan care organizations. So last spring I was conducting research in Moscow, and it was so interesting to find all these detailed and very descriptive columns about the Armenian refugees, their movement, status, and changing conditions in a number of contemporary newspapers and periodicals housed at the National Library of Russia, which is still called after Lenin, at the Historical Library of Russia, and Iskry, published in Moscow during the Great War, is just one of those numerous newspapers writing about Armenian refugees. Tatiana Committee. It was established in September 1914 by Her Highness Grand Duchess Tatiana Nikolaevna, who was the daughter of Tsar Nikolai II. The committee was chaired by State Senator Alexei Neidgard. Among the committee's main responsibilities were providing one-time financial support for refugees, assisting in reparations or resettlement, as well as refugee registration, which was of crucial importance for providing proper help for every refugee, and at the same time trying to do it efficiently. Responding to inquiries from relatives, because many of the refugees got just lost on the way of deportation, and one of the main concerns of the refugees was to find their relatives, or even just to learn about their fate, where there were any relatives left alive and survived. State Treasury supported the activities of Tatiana Committee, and donations from various institutions, committees, and individual donors offered significant sums. The committees also deployed the power of press and placed appeals in newspapers to raise money. As a result, by April 20, 1915, it had raised about 300,000 rubles, which is about $150,000. Acknowledging the potential of artistic events in promoting fundraising, the Tatiana Committee hosted charity concerts, auctions, performances, exhibitions. For example, Goromikina, the wife of the Prime Minister of Russian Empire, organized an arts night in Mariinsky Palace in March 1915, which was a great financial success because an auction of paintings by famous Russian artists brought the Tatiana Committee $25,000 just from that one night. And it's interesting to see in this picture, Tatiana Nikolaevna herself. This is the princess trying to help to remove the cast of one of the soldiers that was wounded during the war. And she participated in many such kind of initiatives, but unfortunately she never made it to Armenia. Among the organizations that actively supported Armenian refugees during the genocide and the Great War was the All-Russian Union of Towns. It was founded in August 1914. Quickly grew into a large organization with branches in a number of towns all over the empire. Its main task was to aid the wounded and sick on the front line and establish infirmaries, evacuation centers, food stations, hospitals. With the escalation of war and opening of the Caucasus front, the Union's responsibilities expanded to assisting refugees who were streaming into the Russian Empire's interior in great numbers. A branch, the Union of Caucasus Towns, or also called Caucasus Department, was founded in Tiflis in September 1914 and under the auspices of Caucasus Viceroy. All of the major towns in the region that joined the Caucasus branch soon opened infirmaries, hospitals, food stations. The Special Central Bureau, consisting of Alexander Khatisyan, the mayor of Tiflis, and the mayors of other major towns, was to coordinate the organization's activity. The Caucasus Department had several tasks: evacuation of the wounded and sick, transportation of the refugees from the front line to the interior, establishment of food stations, sanitary medical assistance, particularly prevention of epidemics during humanitarian operations, and of course collection of donations. All-Russian Union of Towns worked in cooperation with the Union of Zemstvos, which was also established in 1914. And by the middle of 1915, the Zemstvo Union had also turned to providing for the welfare of large number of refugees, many of whom remained in areas under military jurisdiction. The cooperation between these two organizations continued until 1916, but there were a lot of political issues, internal imperial issues, which in the end caused the Zemstvo Union to stop providing assistance for the refugees. Russian Society of the Red Cross was one of the most powerful and successful organizations in the Russian Empire in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. By summer 1914, 39,000 people worked for the Red Cross, including 1,000 physicians and 2,500 nurses. Russian Red Cross opened hospitals on the war fronts, including the Caucasus front, and established hundreds of infirmaries, soup kitchens, and evacuation centers. It operated sanitary trains and vehicle squads responsible for transporting the wounded, as well as disinfecting squads to prevent the highly contagious diseases. Red Cross had printing bureau, and it was responsible for its publicity campaign, informed the entire population of the Russian Empire about the work of the organization, spurring a great number of donations. Some of these funds were used to assist the Armenian refugees on the Caucasus front and in the interior of Russian Empire. You're looking at the cover of illustrated calendar of the Red Cross. This is the issue for 1917. I found all the issues that were published during the Great War and the Armenian Genocide, and although it's called a calendar, it included also detailed reports about the work for the refugees in various fronts of the war, including Caucasus front, and also it gave the updates about the developments in all the war fronts. So it's a very important source for my work and for historians in general. Refugee, humanitarian activity, and financial affairs fell to the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Russian Empire, and they were coordinated by the Special Council for Refugees in Moscow, called Особое совещание по устройству беженцев. It was established in August 1915. The council disbursed funds for the refugee relief, and the first amount disbursed was 25,000 rubles, and of course it increased later on. Among the duties and the functions of the committee, it oversaw the registration and relocation of refugees. It assisted in the return of refugees to their places of permanent residence. I'll go into details whether they were not allowed to return in certain cases. It provided financial support, addressed the spiritual and educational needs of the refugees. Drawing upon materials housed in archives that I already mentioned in Moscow and Tbilisi and elsewhere, my research addresses a number of research questions, here especially particularly concerning the refugees and their status, such as who was a refugee and who was an internally displaced person during the Great War, and did the contemporaries understand these groups in these terms? Because the term IDP came out long after the Great War. However, during the genocide and during the Great War, there were a lot of Armenians who were forced to move back and forth at the borderline, and they were not always refugees because they were moving inside Russian Empire, but they were definitely displaced persons, and in certain cases there was no understanding of the status, and because of that, no way to help them, no official way to help them. So the decree defining refugee status was issued in August 1915, and here we have the definition of a refugee: individuals who left the localities threatened or already occupied by the enemy, or were deported from the military zones at the command of either military or civil authorities, as well as individuals originating from Russia's enemy states. These people were to be identified as refugees, and those who were regarded as refugees were supposed to be issued a refugee card or a refugee book, which accorded them privileges such as access to soup kitchen, financial, medical assistance, etc. At the same time, the authorities, with the help of these refugee cards or books, recorded the travel routes of the refugees and the workplace change of male or female heads of refugee households. As we know, because of genocide and because of the war, sometimes the gender roles change, and of course it was the same case with the Armenians, and in many cases females were the heads of the households in Armenian families. The Minister of Interior appointed General Tamamshev plenipotentiary for the organization of relief efforts for the refugees on the Caucasus Front, and he served as the head of the Department of these refugees on the Caucasus Front until May 1917. The Russian government defined the category of refugees by law, assigned them assistance accordingly. The law, however, was adopted only in August 1915, months after the flow of refugees into the empire's interior. And the efficiency of assistance during that initial period, as well as the influence of new regulations on relief work afterwards, calls more thorough analysis. As many as 120 to 150,000 refugees passed through the Ottoman-Russian border in summer and fall 1915. I apologize. Did all refugees receive assistance after crossing the Ottoman-Russian border? Were the voices of refugees heard, or were they silenced and treated as another wave of people flooding the Russian Empire? Historian Keith Wadenpau emphasizes the crucial importance to show the agency of objects of humanitarianism, and that's one of the major goals of my work, dissertation work. Here you see a picture of Violetta Thurston, British nurse, who published her book, The People Who Run, Bеженцы, because Bеженцы literally in Russian means the people who run, but it's also the word for refugees. And she was fluent in Russian. She traveled in Russian Empire during the Great War, and in 1916 she published her book where she wrote, and I quote, "No one who does not know Russia can imagine the immensity of the great empty distances, the absence of roads and railways, the difficulty of transport, even in times of peace. Much less can they fathom the depth of misery that this hurried flight entailed on the people who run. The English language lacks words to express the suffering that these people underwent, and nothing that we can imagine could be worse than the reality." End of the quote. Reporting on the fate of Armenians in this period and Turkish or Western Armenian refugees, she emphasized that there were not many adults. I quote, "As so many were massacred by the Turks, but a large number of children were there." She described the relief work in the Caucasus in 1915 and 16, where there had been more than 5,000 children collected who did not know their own names nor that of their village. Most of these, as she writes, are Armenian children, and in many of these cases the women have been drowned, the men massacred by the Turks, and it is only by the kindness of some of the villagers that these babies have been rescued. The Caucasus Department opened meal and tea stations as well as medical stations on the Iktir-Echmiadzin-Dilijan-Akstav route for refugees coming from Turkey. The relief organizations aided the refugees transported to and sheltered in the Caucasus internal regions, particularly in Erivan and Yelizavetpol provinces. When the war escalated, Armenian refugees on the front line, as well as in the regions occupied by Russian troops in Iktir, Bitlis, later Erzurum, also received substantial assistance. Echmiadzin, the Armenians' religious center, became a major refugee town in the Caucasus. The number and condition of the refugees were alarming, and the need for assistance urgent. And here I bring a quote from Alexander Khadisyan's report. As in addition to being the mayor of Tiflis, he was also the head of the Caucasus Department of All Russian Union, and he was in the field. He was in Echmiadzin in August 1915, and he was writing, and I quote, "Number of refugees is 30,000. Daily death toll is above 300. 500 corpses remain not buried. Healthy refugees have scattered in panic. Soviet economist and demographer Yevgeny Volkov elucidated the dynamic of the refugee movement in the Caucasus, claiming that within the Caucasus Viceroyalty, in January 1916, there were 220,000 refugees. In May, that number decreased to about 170,000, climbed to 180,000 in June, and reached its peak in November 1916, when the number was 367,000. Those were the registered refugees in the Caucasus in November 1916. Because of the great number of refugees, Russian relief agencies welcomed assistance from Armenian local and national organizations, such as the Echmiadzin Committee of Brotherly Aid. And here you see the picture of orphans next to the orphanage that was founded by this organization. Armenian Central Committee of Tiflis, Armenian Red Cross that was not only established in Armenia but also in various parts of Russian Empire, such as Moscow Committee of Armenian Red Cross. The Russian Empire had complex motivations for assisting Armenian refugees on the Caucasus front. Because of the variety of actors engaged, there were a variety of agendas. Reflecting on the origins of humanitarianism and the various motives behind humanitarian action, psychological, biological, utilitarian, among those, a scholar of international relations, Michael Barnett, asserts, humanitarianism has many mothers. My preliminary research suggests that in addition to the humanitarian sentiments and compassion felt in Russian governmental circles, as well as among ordinary people, many other factors obtained, such as the need to resolve the emergency caused by the refugee crisis in order to secure Russian military success in the war, or adherence to the policy towards other ethnic religious groups in the empire during the war, historical ties between Russians and Armenians, and of course the self-perception of Russian Empire as the protector of all Christians in the region. The Russian Empire had a vast Armenian population in Transcaucasia, spreading from the Kars region to the Black Sea coast and Tbilisi, and from Caspian Sea and Baku to Russo-Iranian border. The empire's policy had not always been favorable towards Armenians. In fact, it fluctuated over time in response to economic, political, and military concerns, as well as geopolitical developments in the region. Changes in Russian policy, especially after 1912, led to the empire's active involvement with the Armenian Reform Project, which aimed to improve the condition of Ottoman Armenians. According to diplomat and scholar Manuk Somakyan, the shift in Russian policy towards Armenian reforms occurred for several reasons. The first one he brings is the Russian Empire planned to use the oppressive rule of Ottoman Christian subjects in favor of its own interests in the Straits. Second, it aimed to deploy the Armenian question and, through Turkish Armenia, control also northwest of Persia. Third reason it brings is Russia's pro-reform policy would regain the loyalty of its Armenian subjects and prevent anarchy in Transcaucasia. We know about revolutionary organizations in Transcaucasia and political parties formed in that period. And the final reason that he brings is that this policy could compensate for the Russian Empire's disastrous defeat in the Russian-Japanese War of 1905 by success somewhere else. Responding to the developments in Ottoman Empire and on the front, as well as unflagging appeals by Armenians to intervene to stop the violence, Tsar Nikolai in 1914 assured the Armenian Catholicos, and I quote, that a brilliant future awaited Armenians, and that after the war, and I quote again, the Armenian question will be resolved in accordance with Armenian expectations, end of quote. Yet the condition of Armenians would deteriorate as the war unfolded. To understand Russian motivations, we must plumb the Russian Empire's plan for the refugees and the occupied eastern territories of the Ottoman Empire. Pointing to the colonization plan of Minister of Agriculture Grivoshein, the Armenian historian Avetis Harutyunyan argues that a Russian anti-Armenian position was obvious from the beginning of the war. Grivoshein presented his project to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in February 1915, and he suggested settling Erzurum, Van, and Bitlis with Cossacks to promote colonization of Western Armenia and to support Caucasus' Fourth Army with food supplies. Historian Peter Hallquist, by contrast, argues that Grivoshein's project was only a suggestion. It was not a state policy. He believes that the Russian government did not have a coherent plan or project for those regions when the war waged, and that annexation was not considered or confirmed officially at that point. Manuk Somakian also mentions Russia's colonization project and the resettlement of Cossacks in the occupied areas. He addresses another crucial question with this. Why did the Russian authorities in some instances prohibit the return of Armenian refugees to their homeland, now occupied by Russian troops? Somakian claims that and I quote, the intended policy was to settle Cossacks in the vilayates of Erzurum and Trabzon, and entry was to be prohibited to Armenians, end of quote. He emphasizes that the permission to return to the vilayates of Alashkert, Bayazet, Diadin was granted only to native inhabitants who could show their right to the property or to land, or who could conclude purchase contracts. These preconditions and requirements made the return of the refugees to their homes highly problematic and in many instances just impossible. The majority had lost their documents and papers when they fled their homes. Peter Hallquist holds that urgent military interests rather than anti-Armenian policy or colonization plan shaped those decisions made by Russian government. And he says, the need to supply the army rather than to prepare the land for Russian colonization lay behind the army's management of Armenian and other refugees. Elaborating further on that point, Hallquist explains that the developments in Russian-occupied eastern provinces of the Ottoman Empire were no different from policy elsewhere at the time and did not target Armenians alone. Well, historian Halit Akarca, in his dissertation, reflects on several plans for administration of the occupied regions in eastern Turkey and offered by a number of military political authorities since 1915. And Akarca's observation about Foreign Minister Sazonov's approach to this issue is that Foreign Minister was inclined to pursue a cautious policy, wait for the outcome of the military operations, learn more about the plans of France, Britain, the Allies, concerning the Caucasus front and territories, and then plan accordingly. Akarca writes that the foreign ministry was, and I quote, trying to preserve the Russian image as the protector of the Armenian cause, but at the same time not trying to rescue them in Anatolia, end of quote. This cautious policy resulted only in joint declaration by powers, but never joint reaction or intervention to stop the massacre of Armenians and save them. So Akarja, like Somakyan and Avetis Hartunian, the historians that I already mentioned, the Armenian historians, speaks about the Russian plan to settle Cossacks in occupied territories, and he writes about General Yuzenich's plan offered after Krivoshein in 1916 in April that implied prohibition of return of Kurds into the area. This shows that Armenians were allowed to return in certain areas while Kurds were not allowed at all. So it does not actually explain the policy in details, but it shows one certain thing, that different historians approached the same problem from their own lens and gave their critical analysis, not looking at the other ethnic groups implementing the policies. While Somakyan and Hartunian, they are talking about anti-Armenian policies, there was also anti-Kurdish policy at the same time going on. So this brings us back to Peter Hallquist's comment about Russian Empire not having a specific policy against any ethnic group, but just following its own interests according to the war developments at the Caucasus front. Talking about colonization, it's also important to understand that it was a common policy in various regions of Russian Empire for centuries. For example, speaking about Russian colonial practices and the use of Cossacks and Russian settlers in the Caucasus, Siberia, Central Asia, genocide scholar Donald Bloxham explains that, and I quote, "It was a standard method of consolidating control of conquered regions." End quote. Russian Empire historian Robert Gerasi reflects on the Tsarist plan to clean the northeast Caucasus area of Muslim tribes and to, and I quote, "replace them with Cossacks and other Russian settlers who would be reliably loyal." Those practices, however, were typically directed against the non-Christian peoples of the Russian Empire or against those identified as unreliable subjects. But Armenians did not belong to either of those groups. Thus, it's very important to understand why Russian Empire was implementing a policy before that not implemented on reliable Christian subjects of the empire. Discussing the imperial plans and the military and administrative aspects of the occupation of Ottoman territories, mentioned historian Halit Akarca finds it important to emphasize the humanitarian occupation of the region as well. He believes that it evolved and changed by time and was motivated by strategic and political concerns. Akarca says, and I will quote, "Yet the task they, Russians, undertook was humanitarian inasmuch as many human lives were saved." Avetis Hartunian, who wrote extensively about the relief work for Armenian refugees both in Caucasus and in Russian-occupied territories of Eastern Turkey, always avoids to use the term humanitarianism when describing Russian assistance. He emphasizes mostly the efforts of Armenian national committees established all over the Russian Empire. Russian people, especially intellectuals, were also interested in organization and implementation of the relief work, and Avetis Hartunian writes, and I quote, "In contrast to terrorism's somewhat anti-Armenian policy, wide clusters of Russian Empire's population provided tremendous moral and financial support to the Western Armenians, helping them to survive." He believes that Russian imperial authorities never actually aimed at protecting or helping Armenians. The state's involvement in relief work was just a byproduct of Russian imperialist and colonization policies. Well, it's important, although remembering this analysis and deductions from different sources that these historians used, also the contemporaries and how they described the assistance and understood the situation. So here I bring two quotes. One is contemporary for the war, and of course the other is a scholar who works on humanitarianism. So the first one is by Pavel Milyukov, who was historian and a politician of the time in Russian Empire. And you see, he was writing that assisting Armenian refugees not only we save lives of individuals, but we also ensure the survival of a nation whose existence is a key to the success of our cultural mission in Turkish regions. So, there was cultural mission, as already talked about, which could be seen as part of the colonization, but at the same time, as Michael Ignatieff says, humanitarian action is not unmasked if it is shown to be the instrument of imperial power. Motives are not discredited just because they are shown to be mixed. Exploring Russian response to the Armenian genocide is key to analyzing refugee movements as a result of the genocide in the Ottoman Empire and the warfare on the Caucasus front during the Great War, and to scrutinizing the dynamics of the refugee crisis by delving into core questions of motivation, decision-making, and implementation of relief work by Russian civil and military authorities. The Great War itself was a challenge to humanitarianism. The early years of the last century were marked by economic changes. New sources of capital investment in philanthropy shifted the contemporary understanding of philanthropy and humanitarianism. The concept of charity evolved into philanthropy, emergency relief turned into long-term development programs. Elucidating the complexity of Russian humanitarianism during the Great War will prompt us to recontextualize the Russian Empire's policy and will shed new light on the meaning and nature of humanitarianism in the beginning of the 20th century. In my conclusive remarks, I will go back to the first point, which was explaining the choice of my research topic. It is crucial to study the history of refugee movements and humanitarian relief work for the people in need, as these crises are unfortunately never-ending, as there are always people in need of support, compassion, humanitarian sentiment, and just struggling to survive. Studying history of humanitarianism in various parts of the world, not only in the West, which has been labeled American exceptional humanitarianism, etc., we see that the desire to help others and save lives of strangers, which is the main concept lying in the core of humanitarianism, was there, and it mobilized people, agencies, governments, empires, not only in the West. The techniques and methods of publicity campaign, fundraising, provision of the assistance for the refugees in Russian Empire in 1915 were no different from any other campaigns during that period or long after it. Here we have two pictures. One is the fundraising poster for refugees and children that was published in Moscow in 1915, and it calls for assistance the same, very similar way to the, for example, nearest relief posters picturing women, children in distress and asking for help. While the second picture is a page from newspaper Gospel, which was published in Baku in May 1915, and the title was Today is the Armenian Refugee Relief Day. Сегодня день помощи армянам беженцам. Nearest relief poster calling for campaign, game picturing a woman and a child, and another picture which shows the campaign for the refugees in Utah in 2015 by the students. So the same techniques are actually used until now, and until now we still have unresolved refugee crisis, and we face problems when we need to solve these issues. Thank you very much for your patience and attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Հարցը հայերեն գուզեմ դալ։ Սլայդները մեկ հատ Ալեքսանդր Խատիսյան, հետո մարդը վարչապետ եղավ Հայաստանի։
Այո։
4 հատ վարչապետ եղել է Քաչազնունի, Խատիսյան, Օհանջանյան եւ վերջինը Վրացյան։ Ուրեմն ասի գհիշեմ 15 թվին գսել որ օրական 300 հայտ քաղաքականներ կմահանան, ճիշտ է։ Սլայդի մեջ ադան գսել։ As նույն okay 30,000 refugee գա 300 անտենեն հիվանդներն գմերին as նույն Խատիսյանն է որ 3 տարի հետո 18 թվին Բաթում գերտապանակցելուց Ալեքսանդրովի պայմանակրի համար Ետ կվերաթար գնան գսես կես կզարմանամ գսե as թուրքերը շաքարի պես մարդիկ են արևմտահայերը ասում ինչպես յոլա չեն երթար նույն բանը հիմա կդարվի Աբորինի կառավարությունը Հայաստանի մեջ ժողովրդի գոբետ չնդրված, ժողովրդի վստահություն չունեցող, ժողովրդի քվեր չունեցող, Սերժ Սարգսյան գոչեցյալ մեկը, գերտա հայ-թուրքական պրոտոկոլներ կստորագրի, ասի եղած է։ Նույն բանը 100 տարի նորեն կգրգռվի։ Եղածները մասսապալ մեր հայերուն հանցանքն են։ Ես կզարմանամ Խատիսյանի պես մեկը 3 տարի առաջ ինչ կսե, 3 տարի հետո ուքա ինչ կսե։
Thank you for the comment.
Ասիաջան, այս պերիոդում եղավ հեղափոխություն, transition-ի մասին ինչ կասեք։
Կարելի է անգլերեն ասել։ No, ես հասկացա հարցը, պարզապես ես եթե կարելի է անգլերեն ասեմ։ Այո։ So yeah, the question was the revolution and what happened at that period. So first of all, my research is about the imperial response to the genocide. So I'm looking from 1914 to 1917 period up to the revolution. But what I can say is that one of the main reasons why I'm looking only to that period is because a lot of things politically, economically, demographically changed because of the revolution, and the structure of all these organizations that were providing assistance changed. Not only changed, for example, Tatiana Committee, the Princesses Committee, would not exist any longer for known reasons. So that would be the short answer to your question. But if you want to know more, I can say that the change is dramatic in certain stances, as Russian troops leave, and in various regions Armenians feel abandoned. And one of the major reasons was revolution, because the new powers that came to power actually called the soldiers back. They were against war, so that was tragic. But at the same time, some of the organizations, like the All Russian Union of Towns and Zemstvos, they, as I mentioned, they were among those organizations that were in those days called so-called public organizations. So they were, there were no NGOs in those days, but they were some sort of organizations that were a bit independent from the Tsar. So they were actually, the founders of the organizations were among the opposition. And during the provisional government period, they were in charge of the state. So these organizations kept working and actually gained more power. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
I have a question for you. Is it on? Yeah.
Yes.
Actually, two questions. I have noticed that you have a comment over there that indicates that Russian Empire, or Russia simply, they did try to, or just didn't allow refugees to go back. Can you just clarify on that? I can hardly imagine any of our refugees would like at the time to go back to Western Armenia after what happened in 1915. And the second question is, you work with Russian archives, I understand?
Yes.
Archives?
Yes.
Are they all digitized that we can access from here, or you have to go physically and just understandably to those, where the sources are now?
Thank you for two excellent questions. As if you know, I wanted to hear those questions. First of all, yes, return and prohibition of return. To answer that question, I will bring an example from very recent experience of refugees who still wanted to go back home, Syrian refugees. Refugees would come to Armenia from Syria and then would want to go back because that was their home there. And if they hear that something maybe is, livable there and they will be able to survive, they will try go back home. It happened, like in thousands, that Syrian refugees came to Armenia and tried to return back to Syria. So in case of Western Armenian refugees, it was 10 times complicated because one reason for them to try to go back was that they wanted to go back home, because even though the assistance was provided for the refugees, it was war. Armenia itself was sending its soldiers to fight the war. Armenians in Armenia were starving, and 300 refugees that come to Russian Empire, they are not enjoying their life there. They are just, as the comment says, 300 people every day just in Etchmiadzin dying. I mean, Etchmiadzin is a tiny town, and it had 30,000 refugees. I mean, it has that much population. So their condition was terrible either way, whether they were in Western Armenia or in Eastern Armenia. But the issue with prohibition of return is even more interesting, because although Armenians would want to go back, and by the way, I forgot to say that in certain cases, they would go back because Russian troops, they occupied certain regions in eastern Turkey. So it was considered to be a safe territory. It was not under Turkish rule anymore. So they were like, if they are from Van, they're like, I want to go back home. It's under Russia now. We are going to be safe. But then there's when Russian Empire comes, and military authorities, especially of Russian Empire, because they were not interested in having Armenians go back to the territories for which they didn't have yet clear plans. As we see, there were several projects for those territories, and having Armenians back to those territories would complicate implementation of those projects. That's about return. And about the archives, so Russian archives, the archives that I use are based in St. Petersburg and in Moscow. And they are not digitized at all. Even the catalogs of the archives, in many cases, are not digitized. So to be able to conduct the research, before the main research, I had to have a pre-research trip there to understand how long it would take for me to work there, where they have any files that would be helpful for me, and then return again, now with the list of all the funds that I need, so that I can go ahead and order the files. And then this whole process takes another century to get the documents out of the archives, because different papers are kept in different buildings. It can be the same archive but has different buildings, and some of the materials would never come because the reason of the rejection written on the form is bad physical condition. And first I wouldn't believe that, but then when I got some of those papers and saw them, I mean, they were collapsing in my hands. I was really scared that they are going to come and find me for moving those papers because they were in terrible condition. But they are not that interested in digitizing the materials, the files, especially the ones that I'm looking at, because they are not about Galicia, about Ukraine, about Lithuania. They are about Armenians. And no one has ever done research on it. I mean, I go ask the material, I look in archives, that's how it works. You have the list of people that previously have used the materials. And I look at it, and like last time someone has opened that file was in 1972. And I don't know that person. It's not like a famous historian of the field. So I don't know what was the reason that person even went and looked at those. It's it's difficult, and it's very different from any archival research in European or American archives. You cannot have copies yourself. You cannot take pictures of anything. They are making the copies, which also takes forever, and so on. Thank you.
In that region, it's not a homogeneous population. This is Russian, Imperial, but there are Georgians, Armenian, Chechen, Circassian. Can you say a couple of words about them? Because this policies are implemented in that mixed region, not a pure Russian policy.
Absolutely, you're right. That's why one of the main points that I make in my research questions is that was that policy towards Armenians in adherence with other ethnic religious groups that were in the same territory? And yes, Russian Empire's policy towards this region was very complex. At the time, they didn't just have a policy. Sometimes they would have different offers and then discuss together with foreign ministry would have certain opinion about certain group of peoples, and then agriculture minister would suggest his own plan, and they would argue among themselves. So in the region that I'm looking at, the Circassians and Chechens, they are not that engaged because it's further to the north of the Caucasus. But of course, in this area, it's mostly about Kurds and Armenians because it's eastern Turkey and western border of Russian Empire. And here, it's also very interesting. It may seem like, well, Kurds were part of Ottoman Empire, they were the enemy nation, so they would be against Kurds and they would protect Armenians from them. And it was not like that. For example, until 1916, it was mostly pro-Armenian, and then Russian government realized that all Armenians have left the territory, or Kurds were just made to flee. And now Russian Fourth Army, Caucasus Army is there, and there is no food for them. So they started inviting back the Kurds to work for them, to provide, assistance to the soldiers who were fighting the war there. So it is very interesting to once you get into it, it opens a lot of new research aspects to it. That it was so complex and so, from a historical point of view, interesting time. Yeah.
In your research, have you come across these imperial different committees? How were they working with Near East Relief or the predecessor ACRNE? And were they working together at all, or they were competing?
Thank you very much for the question. That's one of the very important questions that I still need to find an answer, because as you know, I have worked on nearest relief previously, and that is one of the most interesting topics for me to see whether there was any cooperation. One of the issues is that I'm talking about 1914-17 period. So nearest relief was, first of all, not yet even nearest relief, as you mentioned. It had a different name, and also it was not yet there, because the major group that came to work after war and started providing the major assistance and started cooperating with Russians later on was already after the war in Armenia.
We were there in 1916.
In Armenia with Russians? You have any materials? I would be very happy to see those. Yeah, because for the part that I'm looking at in the documents, I haven't seen any of these Russian organization members mentioning about Americans working with them. Maybe it is for a purpose that is absent from the documents, but they never they mention Armenians. They mention work of Armenians for Assyrians and Greeks even, but I never see an American doing anything there. So I would be very happy to see those.
Someone's going over there. I'll go ahead. Okay. Thank you for this great presentation. What I'm understanding from what you're saying is that your research shows a humanitarian and Christian motivation for providing relief and saving lives and alleviating suffering, but ultimately it is the political interests that determine the fate of a nation that's being subjected to genocide and to other ethnicities who were tormented. And the Christian entities were unable to carry through after the relief phase to ensure restorative justice. And I see in your work, if I may think really big and dream here, that you have, in a sense, uncovered the basis for a challenge to today's international councils of churches to take their work beyond relief into restorative justice, into self-determination for the peoples who have suffered. And I hadn't thought about that in those terms before seeing your presentation, and I want to thank you. It's very enlightening and very inspiring. Your work forms a foundation, I think, and I know you've got a lot more to go in the number of questions you want to research, but I think there's some really interesting things that you're doing. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your comment, and I would say that yes, that's right, and it's not only about the religious aspect of assistance and later on going for seeking for justice and so on, but astonishingly, Russian humanitarianism, it's very different in that sense from American humanitarianism, because if I would say majority of American relief workers were missionaries or were affiliated with the missionary organizations, Russian relief was provided not by religious institutions, but by institutions that were formed exactly for that purpose, to help the people in need. So if we talk about missionary philanthropy that was changing and turning into this development projects, a new form of humanitarianism in 20s in West, we miss this part that in Russia, before that, it was already formed as a humanitarianism in its own form, without religious connection to that. Of course, religious institutions also participated. The church was supportive, and not only the church, but also other religious institutions. As we know, Russian Empire is a multi-religious country. But that is really fascinating to see how, not anywhere else, but in Russia, humanitarianism was developing in its almost like modern sense of the concept. I'm sorry, I think that gentleman is waiting longer.
Thanks for your precious research and greatly appreciated. Thanks for Nasser. Thanks for the Eskijian Museum, and especially thanks for an invaluable Maggie, always. Thanks for Abraham, who records the historic events every time. Today I was expecting to find a representative of the Ministry of Diaspora of Republic of Armenia here. I was expecting also the Council of Republic of Armenia, a representative from the TV stations of Los Angeles. We are part of diaspora. We are part of Armenia. And also 2 representatives of the 2 apostolical Armenian churches to be here. This is a historical event which is invaluable, and we are disregarded as usual.
It's my fault.
We have to wake up. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
It's my fault. I didn't invite them. Sorry.
Good for you.
Yes.
My question is regarding all these researchers that so far that I came and I listened to all our historians like you, and I really appreciate you are very informative. And it's always at the end I get this helpless, hopeless feeling. Even though you are providing all this information and you are gathering all that information, I just want to know if our historians are also in touch and providing that information to our leaders or to our politicians, if we have, so it can be more useful and it gets to somewhere. Because as you said, since the year of 72, no one went and looked into those archives, even though we had Armenia there and we had so many historians in Armenia that they could go and get more information about what happened to us. So is there any hope that, or are you working together so we get better results? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, of course it is important to know that maybe part of work that we do, going to all those archives, trying to find something new, in the end would be also practically used, for matter of fact. And I believe that now our leaders, when they need to have support, when they need to present the case, when they need to argue about the case, they actually turn to scholars for help. For various reasons, but it is important for them to have arguments based on facts, historical facts, primary sources, the results of research. And that's why whenever there is a case going on somewhere, or I don't know, a speech to be prepared, I've noticed many times that first of all they turn to the scholars, which is important, and I don't know how far it will take us and how much of it is used or turns out to be useful for the end goal. But I believe it is useful. Otherwise, I think I wouldn't do this research. And I think the people in Armenia who didn't go and do this research were the ones who did not believe that it would make a change.
Can you get the speaker?
Difficult question. I'm thinking about this. I'm reading Bible. Question is this: we celebrated 1,700 years of becoming the first Christian country in the world. Jesus Christ had 2 legacies. Number 1, love your close people, surroundings. Number 2, forgive your enemy. If we are not forgiving, can we call us Christians?
I would come up with more questions. Who are we? So we are representative of all Christians? And actually, what are we not forgiving? That is my second question. Sorry? Yes, but what are we not forgiving that we're not thinking about? I do believe that you can forgive and still remember and demand. And we should. And also you need someone to ask for forgiveness as well, but that's a long discussion. I don't think we should go into that. And I don't think I have that much power to talk about religion in this building. I feel a bit that's too much of a responsibility.
Okay, I have a question.
Yes.
Maybe I'm going out of line. How difficult was you to get accepted to Clark? Did you get, I know that you were at the Genocide Museum working, so I won't take that side. Did you get any support from the Armenian government or from officials? Any financial support? I'm not talking about what's coming from here, I'm talking from there.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you so much for bringing me here today, first of all. I didn't get to say that. But, the thing is, the way I got into Clark University, I just applied as any other student from any other part of the world would apply for a PhD program. So it was not initiated, supported by anyone, and I mean, technically I did not really need that because application was for free. I didn't have to pay for applying for Clark. It was several tests that I needed to, the exams, and I needed to write an application and send all this package to Clark University and wait until the decision was made. So I didn't exactly need financial support for doing that. Anyone who wants to do that and believes that whatever they do may be interesting and sufficient enough for Clark University program can apply and get or not get accepted. But what I can say about Armenia, one thing is for sure, that how I got to this and how I got to apply to Clark University and decided and believed that it may be possible was due to several reasons, and among them, major role belongs to Armenian Genocide Museum. Because if not that work, I worked 5 years in the museum, and that's when I learned gained most of the knowledge about genocide. Before that, I was a student of international relations. I was interested in Arab-Israeli conflict, overpopulation in China, and so on. And then I got to work in Armenian Genocide Museum, and that changed everything. And as I say, it trapped me. And of course, also another step which encouraged me was the Zorian Institute course, summer course, because there I got to meet all these famous genocide scholars from the entire world who would just come and lecture us and talk to us and encourage us to work harder and to not be afraid to go forward. And all these different steps, coming to UCLA in 2011 as a visiting scholar as well. And I should say that, again, I applied just for a scholarship, and I was lucky to get it and came to UCLA. But I was working at Armenian Genocide Museum at that time, and for one semester I was away. But I got back and continued work there, and it was not made a problem, which could have been a problem in any other institution. So, I think, and I always say that, I think I get very lucky with the people I meet, because I usually meet very kind and understanding people, and that supports me to go forward and take the next step.
Any other questions? Thank you. Thank you, Asya. We are on a continuous mission of lectures, and again from Clark next week, Dr. Umit Kurt will be here, but it's at 5 o'clock next Sunday, and it's the curious case of Ahmed Bey, Faik Bey. He's an Eintepsi, so it's going to be on Eintep, and so this completes us with 3 scholars from Clark University, with Dr. Akjam that has come for the last 4 months to lecture here. And then after that, in 2 weeks break, we have our very famous Maurice Misak-Kaleshian, my very good friend, independent researcher, will give a presentation on Antillas prior to the Catolico state of Cilicia. That's at 4 o'clock. Thank you very much.